Welcome, everybody, to the Center for National Security and Cooperation's weekly research seminar. We are thrilled to welcome here today Professor Mia Bloom, who's a professor of communication and Middle East studies at Georgia State University. She conducts ethnographic field research in Europe, Middle East, and South Asia. Author of numerous books, I think up to 5 now, and in fact she's here to talk about her latest book. But of course, her first book was Dying to Kill, The Allure of Suicide Terrorism. She also published Bombshell, Women and Terror, and now Small Arms, Children and Terror, which this talk is in part based on. She's had a number of affiliations with, taught at Princeton, Cornell, Harvard, and McGill, formerly affiliated with the Council on Foreign Relations, and a member of numerous boards and associations related to the study of terrorism. Her PhD she received from Columbia University. So we're thrilled to welcome you here today. She'll be speaking on Dying Too Young, Small Arms, Children, and Terrorism.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Harold and Emily, for bringing me in. Thank you, Colin, as well. Colin and I went to grad school. So just the reason I do this is how I remember to do my disclaimer. The research was funded in part by the Minerva Research Initiative. And so I put this up as my little, don't forget to say that any mistakes are my own. I don't represent the Minerva Research Initiative, the Department of Defense, or the Department of the Navy, or the US government. And in the last 3 years, I add, in particular, this particular U.S. government. So this gives you a sense of the projects that I work on, although Harold was kind enough to mention all of the different hats that I wear and the books that I have published previously. I just found out last week that Bombshell is going to be released as an Audible book, partly because Small Arms was, so they're competing. But I thought that was nice. After 15 years that the book maybe is still relevant. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit about the research that drove Small Arms, but go beyond the book as well. Some of the theory that I am proposing, the data and the methods that I used, some findings and some of the larger implications. So bottom line up front, children are the target of terrorist recruitment. And what's so interesting about this is that after 1996, when the UN commissioned a study on child soldiering called the Marshall Report, one of the things that resulted was many countries, non-state actors, militant organizations stopped using kids, partly because, you know, the cleansing light of observation, that it became uncomfortable. And so either groups stopped using kids altogether, and there had been so many in Sierra Leone, Liberia, Uganda, and so on, or they did so very surreptitiously. What struck me as so odd was that when ISIS began using kids, not only did they not hide the fact that they were exploiting children in this capacity, but they put the children front and center in their propaganda, and they bragged about it. And in their bragging about it, that is how I was able to collect the materials in the book. And in fact, although I'm literally only counting the kids who are dead, when someone would ask me, well, how many children were trained? We don't actually know how many were trained. We have approximate numbers, but I actually have real numbers of kids who were used as bombers in this capacity or were martyred. And I'm not talking about civilian casualties who died during aerial bombardments. I'm talking about kids who were militant on the front lines. All right, so here were some of the questions that were driving the research. The major question is, how do kids become involved in these terrorist groups? And one of the things I did in the book is make the distinction between involvement in terrorist groups and child soldiering, partly because the mechanism for involvement was so different. A little bit of a challenge to Peter Singer's book, Children at War, that clustered anyone who was under 18. And so from the get-go, I'm challenging some of the conventional wisdom, both this notion of 18, which I really do feel is a Western construct. 18 doesn't mean anything in many of these societies. And in fact, you could even make the argument that, you know, you can't drink until you're 21. So even in our society, 18 might be old enough to buy an AR-15, but not, you know, to buy a shot of bourbon. So you can shoot, but you can't shoot. At the end of the day, at the end of the day, this notion of 18 that was added on. So originally when the UN looked at children, they looked at the age of 16. And I thought, okay, well, does this make sense culturally? And I spent a lot of time reading through the Quran and the Hadith and the Sunnah. And what I found was very interesting, that the age of 15 actually is the age at which a boy can be the mahram, which is the chaperone for his mom or his sister. And I thought, well, you know, that's a pretty big responsibility. In this cultural setting, this is the difference between life or death for the woman, because if someone makes a claim that she's done something untoward, it's the mahram who's going to vouch for her chastity and her good deeds. As well as the fact that ISIS would go into villages and say, okay, who's 15, come with us. So in fact, 15 was something that did resonate. So one of the first things that's a challenge is this notion of 18. The second thing is that when I did my field research in Pakistan, and I spent a lot of time at this facility called Sabaun, and Sabaun is a rehabilitation facility in Malakand. This is the area called Swat where Malala Yousafzai was shot. So this is that part of Pakistan. What they did is anyone who was under 16 got an opportunity for rehabilitation, and if they were 16 and over, they went to the adult facility. So it did seem to resonate in some way. But the thing that struck me as well was that 44% of the children who were involved in SWAT had run away and joined the Pakistani Taliban, that they considered that they had joined voluntarily. So I really needed to challenge this notion that the children had zero agency. So again, it wasn't a dyadic choice, it was along a spectrum, but some of the kids talked about the fact that they had wanted to participate. And this was true when I did my field research in Sri Lanka, of the kids who wanted to be part of the LTTE, which is the Tamil Tigers. The other question I wanted to ask was, you know, well, why do the groups want them? Like, what value added do they bring? And what role do structural conditions play? Because within the literature in political science, we talk a lot about, for example, Bob Pape's argument about the role of occupation, the work that's been done by Jim Walsh and the late Alan Kruger on poverty. So what are these structural conditions and how do they play a role, as well as these cultures of martyrdom that you hear about in the press? So for example, David Brooks will talk about there's a culture of martyrdom among Palestinians, but doesn't unpack what that means. And we don't ever explore who created the culture and for what purpose. And then the final question that was driving the research are, what are the long-term effects, both socially as well as psychologically, on the children and on society when you have militarized children? So there was really no theory, and it's funny, this the origin of the idea for this was in 2003 when I was finishing Dying to Kill. This was part of a MacArthur-funded project that I got when I was at Princeton. And that's how I ended up at Princeton. So it was looking at rape and war, child soldiers, and suicide terrorism. And because when I got to Princeton, 9/11 happened, I switched the order of what I was going to be doing. And so I was finishing in 2003, the first draft of Dying to Kill, and I suffer from terrible insomnia. And so I wrote to Jim Fearon, and I said, you know, I'm curious about the kids. So the two smartest people that I knew, I wrote to Bob Jervis at Columbia and Jim Fearon here. And Bob was like, well, you know, kids are not man, state, or war. They don't vote. We don't consider them as part of IR. And so that was not going to help me at all. Fearon, however, said, well, IR doesn't really talk about kids, but you know what you could do? You could look at an economic model of child labor, and you could look at an economic substitution model as applied to terrorism. And so, although he's not here, please let him know that I give him full credit for the idea. So this is where I got the idea to look at the role of children. Were they a substitute for the adults? And I think that that's sort of the conventional wisdom, that when there's a lull in recruitment or when there's not enough adults, that's when these militant organizations look at non-traditional combatants. They'll look at women, they'll look at children. But Scott Gates introduced another element, and he said, well, the question is whether they're a substitute or a complementary good. And so I'm going to talk about that in a second. But in general, though, IR really didn't look at kids. And till this day, although we have some fantastic case studies from the child soldier literature, we have really wonderful work that's been done, we really haven't gotten there yet as to what role do non-traditional combatants play in, let's say, civil war, causes of war, and I know that there's people around the table that are interested in that. So for the most part, the social science research, not just an IR, was looking at child recruitment from the supply side. You know, they were looking at the role of poverty, education, and war. In particular, the ways in which refugee camps are securitized. And so that within the refugee camp, that might be an ideal venue for recruitment. This notion of either racial, religious, or ethnic identity, the presence of family or its absence. And what I mean by that is the stereotypical story that you would have with child soldiers, and you'll see this in A Long Road Home by Ishmael Bey, is the militants, you know, so the militias come in to a village and they kill the adults and they take the kids. Or they make the kids kill the adults, or they make the kids do something really horrible so that they can't run away and go back to their families. But for the most part, that was still the supply side. I wanted to also look at the demand side. Why did the groups want the kids? And did the kids have, as Scott Gates had suggested, some innate benefit, some talent, something that they could do that adults couldn't? And this is where complementary versus substitute roles comes in. So let me just, for those of you less familiar, explain what I mean by a complementary good. Anyone who's ever bought a Middle Eastern carpet, the first way you ascertain the quality of the carpet is you flip it over and you count knots per inch. And that the more knots per inch, the higher quality of the carpet, usually the higher the price. So what happens with, thank you, what happens with the rug is you flip the rug over and you count the knots per inch. Now, the reason why you have such a large role for child labor in the rug industry in places like India and Pakistan and Egypt and other places is that the children have small little fingers and they can make smaller knots per inch. And so they actually, it's not that the children are substituting for adults, for example, let's say farming, they actually have a talent or a skill set that the adults don't have because they've got their little fingers. How are we doing?
Yeah, just click these.
Okay, so click those. All right, so that's where I am now. So what happens then is that, don't worry, you didn't miss many good photos. What happens then is that I had to ascertain whether the children had some innate talent or some skill set that the adults didn't have. So it wasn't just about, you know, losses in battle and now we're going to recruit children. And what I found, and again, maybe it's less parsimonious, but it's more accurate, is that it wasn't a dyad. It wasn't that children were either substitute goods or complementary goods. In fact, it was a spectrum. And that depending on these 5 elements, that varied whether it was the ideal type of substitute or the ideal type of complement. So a lot of it had to do with the ideology of the conflict. Did the ideology allow for children to play a role? And what were the structural conditions of the conflict? And we talk about, for example, the role of the cultures of martyrdom. The specific temporal stage of the conflict. So when were children introduced? At the beginning, the middle, or the end? The ability or inability to mobilize adults. Like women, very often the terrorist organizations would use children in part to goad adults and to show, you know, well, the men are not being sufficiently manly. And so that's why they would highlight the role of children and say, well, you know, the kids are willing to fight. What are you willing to do? And then finally, a lot of it had to do with targeting as a tactical innovation, in part because in some of these societies, the children are almost invisible. And the fact that they could blend in with civilian targets so that when you're attacking a hard target, a military installation or the police barracks, a woman or a child is going to stand out like a sore thumb. But if you're targeting a market, then children and women are going to be present and they blend in. And so these mimetic behaviors. And so what were some of the hypotheses? Well, the first hypothesis was that, oh, I'm supposed to do it this way?
Oh,
it is working now? Okay. Is that there was an increase, despite the fact that 1996 had seen a lull and a drop off of groups, militant groups and militias using kids. All of a sudden now we saw an uptick again. that mobilizing the children for militant activities provided some comparative advantages, either the element of surprise or their small body sizes. They were able to get into certain places that adults couldn't. And then finally, that the use of children ensured that the conflict would be multi-generational, that we would see that it wasn't just, because we know from Jones and Libicki, something like 95% of terrorist groups disappear within the first year, 2 years. And what it did was it ensured some continuity, but it also provided some ability to withstand targeted assassination. And I'll give you an example from Indonesia. When the Indonesian counter-terrorists got rid of, Jamaat Islamiyah in Poso and Jolo and Yogyakarta, what they had was they would either arrest or kill the leaders of the cadres of these particular locations, and their 14 and 15-year-old kids just stepped into their place. And it was a seamless transition of power. And so what this did is it basically made targeted assassination far less effective. The last thing is, and this is again is maybe a project for future, is that militaries that are facing children are going to experience far higher levels of PTSD because they're kids, and because we are, in many ways, Western militaries are constructed to protect women and children. When they find themselves in situations where the orders are to shoot at kids, it becomes a little bit more difficult. So what were the sources and the methodology that I used? For the most part, it was a combination of primary source data collection, Pakistan and in Israel, and in, I'm supposed to go to Nigeria. That was postponed because I'm doing some work on Boko Haram. There was also very interesting, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it as I talk, about this digital ethnography. I was able to get into the semi-encrypted platform of Telegram, and I've been there for over 4 years, monitoring everything that ISIS posts on its official platforms, but also monitoring some of the things that are said in the chat rooms. And the IRB allows me to observe but not participate, which they're kind of mean girls sometimes. I'll show you in a bit, but you have to ignore your desire to respond occasionally. And then again, there was some interviews. And so I was able to collect a lot of interviews if I myself wasn't able to go. So what is Telegram telling us? One of the things, as I mentioned, is that ISIS has bragged about the kids that it puts on its social media platform, Telegram. Now, you'll see here from behind me, I have a sample of 4, and I'm going to turn around for a second. You can see in the blue box, it tells you what the media regional office was. So that tells us where. The red box that says Ajal is breaking news. And on top, you have a Hijri date. And so we could very easily translate the Hijri date into a Gregorian date. So now we have when. The Chiron, let's say it says Al-Akh al-Istishhadi Abu Uday al-Shami. So what it tells us is we know he was an Istishhadi, so he was a martyr, but a self-martyr, because they have different words for martyr in Arabic. We know his kunya, his name, so we know where he's from. He's from Sham, so he's from Syria. And then we have, in Arabic, taqabbalahu Allah, which means may God have mercy on his soul, or may God accept his soul. So we know right away he's dead. And so what we were able to is take each of these images, of which we had over 445 dead kids over the span of the 4 years of study, and we were able then to code the images along 20 different criteria. And the idea was to get a sense of where, when, how many kids. And interestingly enough, on the far right, Abu Khattab al-Sanjari, as soon as we saw al-Sanjari, we knew right away, that's a Yazidi kid. And sure enough, eventually we got his real name, which is Asad Majo. And he and his brother had been kidnapped Mount Sinjar in April 2014, along with ISIS's capture of all the Yazidis. And over a 2-year period, these 2 kids were brainwashed to then become car bombers and suicide bombers. So in this corner here on the lower left, you see this, he's al-Barnawi, so we know he's Nigerian, and Boko Haram. So ISIS wasn't just advertising and bragging about the kids who they were deploying in Syria and Iraq, but throughout the entire area. And it also gave us some indication that as ISIS shifted its area of operations from Iraq and Syria to places like Afghanistan and the Philippines, you could track what ISIS was focusing on by where they were having their operations in real time. And this is what the data, the coded data looks like over the period of the 3 years. Right now, although the data collection continues till today, we have 20,410 pieces of coded data that we are eventually using for the Harvard Dataverse to make it available for researchers in a non-monetized fashion so that people can do searches. And I'll talk more about that in a second. And this is what I meant by the IRB is very strict. So even when they make fun of me and basically say that I'm apparently not slave market material, I could observe but not respond. So it was very interesting. This was the same week as Stephen Paddock. So Stephen Paddock was okay standing around with his martini, but apparently me in front of $10,000 worth of Pappy Van Winkle elicited the I'm an alcoholic. The bottles were full, they were not empty. But yeah, so we did have to be very careful about not just the protection of the subjects, but the researchers. Now, on a monthly basis, this is what the data collection looks like. So we do see what we've seen in the press, that there's been a decline in the media production from ISIS. But it's not clear that, you know, sometimes when we see a decline and you're taking 4 random dates over the years, that's not telling you as much as a daily compilation. So what did we do with the data beyond collecting the data for the children? We applied machine learning. So I worked very closely with computer scientists, and we were able to then teach the computer to see what is the person, what is the gun, what is the tank. And we're in the process now of going through the 20,410 images and being able to apply what we call a convolutional neural network and a fully convolutional neural network in AI to allow people to do research and do the searches automatically. The other data points that we got from Telegram was the ways, the roles for the children, the ways in which the children were used by ISIS, including teaching 10-year-olds how to drive, an automatic, not a stick, but teaching them to drive just for the purpose of being car bombers, as well as the fact that they were hunting and they were selecting children based on certain criteria and skill sets. And so I've written previously about how terrorist groups talent spot. And so if they found a child who was particularly attractive and articulate, they would put that child on the Dawa caravan. And this is where this notion of shaming the adults. Here you have a child, he's wearing his camo, he's got the microphone, and he's telling the people in the crowd, you need to step up and you need to join ISIS. And so by coding all of the images of the children who had been sacrificed by ISIS as bombers, we were able to get a sense of what were all the different roles that ISIS used children for, both in terms of ones that are more expected, like activists or apprentice or cook or porter, because you know when you ask them, everyone was a cook and a porter. Anyone who's ever captured by ISIS is going to claim to be a cook, and you would think that, you know, all they're doing is cooking because no one claims anything else, but the images tell us more. The other thing that was really important, and I mentioned this when I talked about the chyrons, when you're doing this work in translation, one of the problems is the word in English for martyr is martyr. But in Arabic, you've got murabit, and you've got mujahid, and you have shaheed, and you have istishhad, and each of those, and ingamasi, and each of those 5 different ways of saying martyr gives you more information about what they did. An ingamasi is very different than an istishhadi, is very different than a murabit. And so that was why it was really important to do this work in Arabic, and then show what these nuances were. The other thing that, again, it was unexpected that we received, was that we could see that there was an element of, like what Heghammer talks about foreign fighters amongst the adults, there were child foreign fighters in ISIS. And ISIS made very clear, you know, if someone was from Tajikistan or Yemen or Malaysia, that was part of their kunya. But we noticed, well, wait a second, some of these foreign fighter kids are single use. Take a picture, make a video, they're off in the battlefield and they're dead. But other kids were used over and over again, in particular, the children of Western foreign fighters. So in May 2016, you see that there was a video by Al Hayat, which is the media corporation for ISIS, called 100%, which is in French, blood for blood. But if you say it really fast, it means 100%. And I thought there is no way that ISIS is that clever. Sure enough, they stole it from a Moroccan rapper. But in May 2016, and you see the kids are fully kitted out, they've got their weapons, they've got their camo, but they were not used once in a video and then they died, because several months later, the exact same kids were then in another video where they were executing Kurdish prisoners. And I didn't add this information. ISIS added, he's Egyptian, he's British, he's Tunisian, he's Kurdish. In other words, ISIS was deliberately conveying the international elements of the caliphate. I was calling this United Colors of Benetton ISIS, but also we could track the individual kids over the period of 4 years as they got older. You know, so we could see, for example, this very young 2-year-old being trained with a toy gun to eventually, at the age of 4, executing someone by shooting him in the head. We could also track someone like Abdullah, who had gone from being a bystander at an ISIS rally in 2013 to being trained in a video in 2014 to executing Russian allegedly FSB spies in 2015. So it was very interesting to be able to watch the kids grow up. It's like that Boyhood movie, but you could watch the kids grow up in the propaganda. And we were able to identify a half dozen of these foreign fighter children, and they selected the kids who were physically attractive, who were racially and ethnically diverse. They were trying to convey, come to the caliphate, you know, we are this utopian society. So in order to understand children's involvement in the terrorist groups, we really need to understand how were they initially mobilized? How were they recruited? What level of coercion versus co-optation and luring? But also, it was very important to understand the environmental factors and this construction of a culture of martyrdom. What was the role of the parents, the educators, the coaches, the religious authorities in terms of understanding why, unlike the child soldiers where the parents were absent because they'd been killed by the militias, why were these religious authorities and why were these parents and teachers giving the terrorists access to the kids? And so I drew from Uri Brofenbrenner's social ecology model to understand that children are nested within layers of individual, both at the individual, at the micro, meso, exo, and macro system, as well as there's a temporal element, to understand what was the role of all the elements of the society. And so it also offered opportunities for intervention, depending on at what level. So children were being affected by even things that they themselves didn't understand or interact with because it was part of the social ecology of their being. The other thing I did was I deconstructed these cultures of martyrdom. What did it mean? So again, what was the role of the parents and the teachers and the schools in constructing the culture of martyrdom? And so I looked at instances in places like Palestine and in Pakistan and in Lebanon. And one of the things I noticed that was really surprising is that, again, we're differentiating between the martyr who's killed and the martyr who kills themselves. In Arabic, those are different words, but the kids who were killed were commemorated in ways that made risking your life or losing your life something to aspire to, because the kids who were killed were commemorated. And I just used one example here of Muhammad Dura. For those of you unfamiliar, Muhammad Dura there's a well-known image of he's hiding behind his father. The picture was captured by French photographers, and he was caught in a crossfire between Palestinian and Israeli forces, and both he and his father are killed. But he's a postage stamp in all of these countries, whether it's Iran, Iraq, Morocco, Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan. In other words, both countries that are friendly and unfriendly to the United States have made him a superstar. And so this was where you are really sending very perverse messages to children that the best way that they can contribute to their society, to their family, to their people is through their death. And one of the ways in which the terrorist groups were able to manipulate this is through children's programming. So, for example, Hamas TV has a series of television shows that are directed for very young children. These are children under the age of 12. And there was a jihadi Mickey Mouse named Farfour. And you can see that instead of just talking about Watan and Dawla, like the land and the people and religion, they had to find ways to make very young children relate to the panic. And so if you're talking about things that are over children's heads, they can probably parrot and repeat by rote what they hear the adults say. But if you talk to the kid and you say, it's like that time I lost my notebook before school, every child can relate to that. And so they were very good at using language that children could understand, in addition to language that was above their heads for their age, like we will slaughter them, so that the kids will repeat, we will slaughter them. The interesting thing about Farfour is on live TV, while he was filming, so they were, you know, it's in real time, they had a bunch of guys come in dressed as Israeli IDF soldiers to kill him. And so like the kids were traumatized. They're watching TV and all of a sudden Mickey Mouse is killed. So what is the message? The message is that, and this is across all of the different conflicts where children are used by terrorist groups, that your death is more valuable than your life, that you can do more dying than you can by living. And it's a very problematic message for the kids because it's this notion of altruistic suicide. It's this notion that they won't be significant without it. So looking at the social ecology, the project collected ISIS textbooks both in Arabic and in English. And you can see, so it's the Al-Kharoof series, and you see like B is for bandukiya, so it would like be like G is for gun. But this wasn't unique because when I did my field research in Northern Ireland, you had the exact same thing in Republican textbooks. And so they have the images from the IRA logos, and A is for Armalite. And for those of you unfamiliar, Armalite is the AR in the AR-15. And so we see this across multiple contexts. It's not one culture, not one religion. When we go back to the ISIS grade 2 mathematics books, we see this is how they learn their maths. They learn to count the guns and the weapons and the bullets. My favorite, however, is this is how we learn how to tell time. The clock is affixed to a bundle of dynamite, and that this is in their grammar book. And so it's, you know, what time is it? It's boom o'clock. So what are the results from the data then? The results on, so looking at the data on a monthly basis, we do see that there was pretty much an increase for the most part up until the Battle of Mosul, and then the use of children dropped off. Now we're starting to see it in different areas, for example, in Afghanistan and in Southeast Asia. And then sort of inspired in part by Kidd and Walter, we tried to see what was going on in the conflict at the time where there were the apexes and the naders. And there was approximately a 1-month lag between a loss in battle and an uptick in the use of kids. So that at least gives some legitimacy for the notion of a substitution model. But here's the most important takeaway I want you to have as you leave the talk. We didn't just look at ISIS. Me and my grad students looked at all the groups. ISIS is the black line. The red line is the Free Syrian Army. So what we discovered was that every single group in Syria and Iraq were exploiting kids on the front lines, including the ones that we consider to be the good guys, including the YPG and the Kurdish groups, the Free Syrian Army, and so that there were no real good guys. Everyone was exploiting children. And I will tell you that this is, you know, I almost feel bad that this was the data point, because I have shared this with the US government, and as we're pulling out and we're like abandoning people in Syria, in particular our Kurdish allies, I really hope that this didn't contribute to it. Looking at the children in Syria by nationality, what we were able to see is over the period in 3 years, there was some diversity, about 94 kids that we can prove were killed. But in Iraq, there were so much more, and so much more diverse set of children. So you see many more countries represented. So what were some of the findings then? That every single group in Syria and Iraq used children on the front lines, including the allies of the United States, including the ones that we consider to be the good guys, because they were fighting ISIS. ISIS, in fact, was a late adopter compared to the other groups. Now, of course, after 2016, the Kurds stopped publicizing the age of their fighters, and so that's why I couldn't continue the study. But the reason that they stopped publicizing it in 2016 is they knew it was awkward that they were using kids in the same way, and that they were expecting to get support and financial support from the West. That the number of ISIS child fighters increased up until the Battle of Mosul. that ISIS in Iraq deployed 340% more children than in Syria, and that Iraq was a much more diverse group. Also, that ISIS foreign fighter children, because I wanted to leave time for Q&A. When we look at the foreign fighter children, we got different results than the foreign fighter adults. So I know that there's some people in the room who study this. What is the country that has generated the most foreign fighters for ISIS? Does anyone know? Okay, I thought for sure someone would know. So it's Tunisia. And so depending on whether you're looking at ICSR or the Soufan report or the work that's been done, initially we thought it was as high as 8,000. It's been readjusted by Sir Richard Barrett down to about 4,000. 4,000 Tunisians left to go fight and die for ISIS. I didn't get any Tunisian kids for ISIS. I got other Tunisian kids, but not for ISIS, which said to me that the Tunisians went to Syria and Iraq unmarried, because now we have Tunisian kids in Libya and in Rouge and in Al-Hol. So there are Tunisians, but they went, got married, had the kids, and the kids were still too young. Even though the youngest executioner I have is 4, they would have been too young to even participate. The other thing is that, sorry, I lost my train of thought. When you looked at the Western foreign fighter children, they were more likely to be used in propaganda and on the Dawah caravan than to be killed, because ISIS treated the kids that they took from the orphanages and the schools as very expendable, and they treated the Western foreign fighter children as more valuable, so that they were making these distinctions, and that there was more or less, as I mentioned, an approximate 1-month lag between a major loss in a battle and an increased use of children. I'm right on track here. All right, so what did we prove? What do we have evidence for? And what do I still need work to do on? All right, that there was an increasing recruitment of children, proves. That the children gave some comparative advantages, we have preliminary evidence. For example, with the Ingamasi was a unit, sort of a mixed unit of adults and children. And the way in which ISIS would use these mixed units is that they would send the kids in first. Perhaps the target would hesitate for a second. And just in that moment of hesitation, then the adults would follow in. And so these commando raids that had mixed adults and children were able to use children's either look of innocence or the surprise element to their advantage. And then the final thing, the final hypothesis about multi-generational, I'm going to have to see in the long term. That's a long-term question to answer, as well as the fact that I've started talking to people who were veterans. Getting the IRB for this is getting complicated, so I have to spend a little bit more time getting permission to talk to vets who are suffering from PTSD, in part because they found themselves shooting at kids. And in fact, Romeo Dallaire in Canada has a large repository of vets, Canadian soldiers, who came back from the fray talking about their experiences. What are the implications then? And I'm almost finished. Well, the implications were that online, as ISIS was targeting young people, and this wasn't the children, it wasn't like under 10, these would have been the tweens and the teens, a lot of the recruitment online looks exactly like grooming by pedophiles, that they were using some of the same thing. They would identify a target, and that they would establish rapport and gain their trust, that they would offer to fulfill some sort of need. Oh, did you want to help the children in Syria? This is the only way to do it. But also that they would insist that they would isolate the victim from their family. So this is where the Bethnal Green Academy girls just disappeared in London. And so what we did was I worked very closely with a colleague of mine, Ian Elliott, who's an expert on pederasty and child sexual grooming. And the only thing we added to the literature on child grooming was the word culture of martyrdom. This actually, although it represents the terrorist groups that I studied, comes from the literature on child sexual exploitation. I'm going to stop here in part because if you have a question about the interviews, here's a sample interview from Pakistan, from Nasser, who actually his mother handed him over to the Pakistani Taliban. We'll talk more because I'm going to stop here and offer time for questions. Thank you again for your time sitting through this incredibly depressing presentation.
Thank you, Mia, for an amazing, very challenging talk. We have about 45 minutes for Q&A. I'd just like to remind you, one finger to get on the queue, two fingers to jump in on the discussion immediately at hand. Please state your name and affiliation. I don't think we all know each other in the room. By custom, we always give the fellows the first 4 or 5 questions.
That was the Tilly style.
Yes.
I like that. Chuck used to do that. All the grad students would sit at the table and the faculty had to be on these sides.
Yep. So I see, okay, I have Nandita, Asfandyar, Iris, Melissa. Okay.
What was the first one?
Nandita. So why don't you go ahead, Nandita?
Thank you. Nandita Balakrishnan, a pre-doctoral fellow here at CSAC, also a PhD student at Stanford. So I have 2 quick questions. First is, can you speak a little bit more about the variation in gender in the types of children that ISIS is using? Obviously, I would assume that it's probably skews male, but I don't want to assume.
100%.
Right.
Yeah.
But do they actually recruit women as well? Because you did show one example of a female hunter as well.
Okay, so I'm going to differentiate recruitment from use as sort of on the front lines. So this was very interesting. So I knew that there were 453 female bombers for Boko Haram during this period, in part because Hilary Matfess and Jason Warner had published studies, both in CTC and then later in security studies. So I knew what the numbers were. And so I have one boy, Barnawi. They didn't publicize any of the girls for Boko Haram, although they published the boys. So we didn't see any girls that had been used on the front lines, either as a bomber, as a car bomber, as a scout. There were almost 0 pictures of girls on their social media. But we knew that they were recruiting the women. But what they were recruiting the women were mostly as jihadi brides, is the term that they used. And so they were targeting very young women. And I apologize, it's going to be really offensive, because they were then evaluating the women based on hair color, skin color, breast size, and virginity. And that depending on this matrix, the whiter, the blonder, the better, and they would allocate them to their commanders based on rank. So the higher rank commander got the younger, blonder, whiter girls. Then what would happen is, inevitably, the husbands would die, and the women were due 3 months and 10-day period of iddah, which is like a mourning period. And this is mandated in the Quran because you have to make sure that the woman isn't pregnant, so that there's no confusion if a child is born, who's the father and who's the family of the child. And what was happening is that the women had become such a commodity that ISIS was turning them over faster than the 3 months and 10 days, to the extent that the women were complaining. And some women even left ISIS because they were like, well, wait a second, they're violating their own rules. And so they were recruiting women, like foreign women in particular, but they weren't recruiting them in the same ways. They weren't training them the way they train the boys. The last thing that was very interesting is at some point, many of the women were complaining in social media that some of the foreign women were dying, and they were dying for medical reasons because, of course, they couldn't go see a male doctor. And so you would have like Tara Niddleton, who was an Australian convert, died of an appendicitis because they couldn't get a doctor to her in time. One of the things so interesting then is that ISIS then started targeting women's medical colleges and women's nursing colleges throughout Pakistan. So I was in Lahore at the medical college, and many of the women are very religious, and they're not in a hijab, they're in a niqab. So this is all I'm seeing. And they were telling me they started getting messages on Facebook and on other social media platforms to try to lure them because ISIS needed women with medical training. So the recruitment of women wasn't for fighting, but they definitely commoditized. Now, I'm going to make one exception. With the Yazidi women, they were trafficking them and benefiting financially. And as we know from some of the stuff that Nadia Murad wrote, that's the woman that won the Nobel Peace Prize 2 years ago, they were treating the Yazidis as sex slaves. And they were finding justifications in the Quran for what they called sadbi, which is sex slaves. So that's where, so I didn't get any girls in my sample at all, not one. Even the 453 women for Boko Haram that they could have included.
Sandyar?
Thanks so much for the talk. Really enjoyed it. Learned a lot. I'm Sandyar Mir. I'm a postdoc here, and my own work is on counterterrorism as well. So I'm thinking about implications of your findings for targeting specific pieces of counterterrorism policy. So I've been tracking the battlefield in Afghanistan closely. It appears that the U.S. has killed a lot of children who are purportedly child soldiers in Iraq, Syria, Cubs of Caliphate. Targeting of the Cubs has been extensively reported. And in the implication that you've covered, I think you are warning us of some of these backlash effects, which are likely, especially with the intergenerational dimension. But on the other hand, you're also showing these powerful functional roles that children have on the battlefield, from propaganda to media to shaming adults, which I think is extremely powerful. The law of armed conflict certainly allows for targeting of child soldiers, as disturbing as that is. It is a reality. So I'm wondering how to sort of think about the findings that you're offering. What are the trade-offs here? There are some real battlefield considerations involved. So yes, any sort of reflection on implications for target killing?
Yeah, absolutely. So I saw this movie, American Sniper, with Bradley Cooper. I think a lot of people saw it. One of the things that's in the movie is he's got a child in his sights, and he's trying to decide, does he shoot the child, does he not shoot the child? And over the earpiece, he's hearing, take the shot, take the shot. And what happened was, through most of this period, there wasn't clear standard operating procedures for the American military whether or not to take the shot. That each individual commander either had to make the call for their own men, or the individual soldier had to make the call, which I think in some ways might actually exacerbate the PTSD, because if you're following the rules of battle, then, it almost becomes like muscle memory. But if at some point you're the one that has to make the call, you will ultimately feel more responsible for the result. And I think that it was important that the American military, so the Canadian military did it first, and the American military started to talk about this more substantially, to create an SOP. That, okay, so if the child is bearing an IED, you don't shoot the child bearing the IED. You can just wait for the child to leave and get rid of the IED. But if the child is about to blow something up, like as a suicide bomber, so that they had to create more nuanced rules of battle rather than have the individual soldier make that call. Because I do think that it's a lot of pressure, especially if you can imagine many of these American soldiers have kids of their own, and may even have kids that age of their own. And so that's a very tough call. I think that we have to, and again, might sound counterintuitive to what I just said. Many of these kids had no idea what they were doing. Up until a certain age, when a child is handed a remote control, so Issa, this well-known Khadija Dare, who was a convert from Britain who went to ISIS, and she has her 4-year-old son, and she hands him a remote control, and mommy says, press the button, and Issa at 4 presses the button, and a car blows up with 3 people in it. Yes, technically Issa blew up 3 people in a car, but he didn't know what he was doing. And even the kid who's shooting someone in the ballpark, in the head, I still don't think that the child fully comprehends what the notion of mortality is. He's basically following what the parents are saying. And in many of the videos, we see the parents egging the kids on. So I do think that no matter what the child has done, these kids are fixable. I mean, the thing that I saw in Pakistan is that there were kids, they'd been trained as suicide bombers, and some of them failed on purpose because they actually didn't want to do it. Some of the kids had seen or participated in beheadings. And yet, by the time they had gone through the program at Sabaun, there were regular kids playing cricket, eating ice cream, being, you know, little kids. So I think that all of the kids are salvageable. And so I'm sort of, now that we're facing what do you do with the kids, and Kosovo, for example, just took back 74 children. And the various European countries, one by one, are trying to ascertain, do we take the kids back? Do we not take back the families? I do think you need to take them back, because leaving them in Al-Hol or Roj or in these camps guarantees that there will be a problem that we're facing in 10, 20 years. So I think the implications, not everyone would necessarily agree with my conclusion that the kids are fixable, but they are. I've seen it. But here's the caveat. The Sabaun facility, which is located in Swat Valley, it's in Pakistan, Pakistani kids, funded by the Pakistani government, guarded by the Pakistani military, and many of the Pakistani elites and civil society pay for it. There's no question which country is responsible. It's a Pakistani problem and a Pakistani solution. What we have in Syria and Iraq is we've got, you know, like the mother can be from the Netherlands, and there's 3 different fathers, and there's 4 different kids, and each kid is from a different, and nobody wants that kid. And everyone is jockeying not to take responsibility. And it becomes extra difficult when no one is stepping forward to say, yeah, we'll take them. The other challenge has been, in Pakistan, on average, of the hundreds of kids who've gone through the Sabaun facility, it ends up being about $20,000 to $30,000 per child, which I think is a fantastic investment. But you could imagine someone making an argument in Washington, D.C. Well, you know, there's kids in Arkansas that their parents didn't take them to ISIS. And so why are we spending American tax dollars to rehabilitate some child? So in other words, there's a political issue about spending and allocating resources, that you have these perverse incentives now, right? You have people who did something awful by taking their kids to Syria and Iraq that are going to be rewarded for it. And then you have people who never went that are not going to be getting the same benefits. So it becomes politically very difficult to make the case for the rehabilitation. The last thing in terms of counterterrorism is that if the parents understood what the, so I am going to go through and show you this here. The sample interview with Nasser and his mom. Nasser's mom basically said to me, you know, he was drinking a lot and he was taking drugs. And I really thought that the Taliban would fix him. And she said, not only did he not fix him, and they taught him to be a bomber, and she said to me privately, I think they messed with him, meaning she felt that he had been sexually abused. If the parents and the teachers and the clergy and all of the sources of authority would actually know what the children are facing as a future, not just becoming a martyr, which they may actually think is a great thing, but that there's individual levels of trauma that the children will be exposed to, they might not be so willing to give the terrorists access. So in terms of an implication, I think making the results known, making what is actually happening to the kids known is a benefit, as well as the fact that we need to do better and ensure that we can find ways to take the children back, rehabilitate them, reintegrate them, and follow, if we can't follow the Sabaun model perfectly, we can at least aspire to a model that is a multi-pronged approach that covers them psychosocially and gives them access to therapists, but also vocational training and teaches them Islam, because the version of Islam that most of these kids have learned is a completely distorted one. So I don't know, Sandhya, if I answered all of your questions, but we can talk more about this.
So I have Iris, Melissa, and then Lynn, and then Paul. Okay, Iris.
Thank you for the talk. I'm Iris Mullen. I'm a postdoc fellow here. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how you think incentives to recruit children change over the course of different campaign stages, and why it is you mentioned ISIS started relatively a little bit later than other groups you looked at.
Good question. I think using children at the outset has a different motive. It's about shaming the adults. It's about having a low base rate for recruitment, and you're using the kids less because you need their skill, but more because you need their ability to show that, okay, this community is willing to help, and it's a kind of social pressure, peer pressure on the adults. I think in the middle stages, because we saw such innovative ways that children were used. So for example, in Africa, you had dedicated child units. The Maoists had dedicated child units. So across a number of instances, instead of having children with child commanders, mixing them in, they found that this was a tactical innovation that was really effective at eliciting a surprise reaction. And even, like I said, that few seconds of hesitation that it's a child and you're confused, like, why is there a child all of a sudden with a gun? That was enough to have these Ingamasi raids, because the Ingamasi raids didn't necessarily lead to the death. They sometimes were used multiple times. In terms of the stage of the conflict, at the end, for me, that would have definitely been just a substitution effect, that they're desperate. And I think it relates something in 2005, someone was asking me about suicide terrorism from dying to kill, and they said, is this a tactic of first resort or last resort? And for me, it was always of last resort. It was that all the other tactics had failed, because if you're going to lose the operative at the end, unless you are gleaning some other benefit, you're going to have to start all over again training others. So I think that when it happened at the end of the conflict, then it was clearly desperation. And here's where, for me, it got interesting. So you guys know that ISIS comes from Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2005 started using female suicide bombers. At no point did ISIS then say, we're really desperate, we're on the ropes, let's use the women. They just didn't. They refused. And it never made sense to me. So they were still willing to sacrifice the children, but they were never willing to tap 50% of the population by using the women. And I don't know, it's because now the women are saying in Al-Hol and Al-Roj, that's because, you know, they're there to guarantee the next generation, and they will give birth to the fighters that will fight in 10 years from now or in 15 years from now. I don't know if that's the case, or if it's just that it was such a misogynistic organization that it, even though its parent group used women. So the different kinds of incentives over the conflict stages reflected in the ways in which children were operationalized and weaponized. And it is really interesting now. So I only have the 4 years to observe, but now as ISIS is shifting to other places, whether it's in Africa, like we're seeing Mali, we're seeing an uptick in Boko Haram, and then we're seeing in places like Southeast Asia and the AFPAC areas, we are going to be able to make some cross-regional comparisons that will look, I think, interesting. With Boko Haram, I asked, I was doing some preliminary research on Nigeria, and I spoke to Dr. Fatima Akilu, who runs a rehabilitation facility in Maiduguri, and also Maji Paturks, who runs one in Kaduna. And kids were not used initially. So Boko Haram had a very traditional trajectory. They used adults starting in 2011. They got desperate. They started using women in 2014. And then they skewed their operatives younger and younger and younger throughout the period from 2015 to 2019. And so, again, very traditional, very expected, no surprises. ISIS kept varying things. And so part of it is that, you know, unless I get to a commander, I don't know if I'm ever going to find out exactly why. Was it ad hoc, or was it that there were different commanders issuing different orders? That, for me, remains a question that I want to answer.
Thanks. Melissa?
Melissa Carlson, I'm a UC Berkeley PhD student.
Oh, you're the one that speaks Arabic. You do Middle East? Yes. No, Jason Klochek told me to say hi.
I was like, okay, I didn't realize that my reputation extended so far, but yes, Jason is
Yes.
my friend. So thank you for your presentation in particular. I think it's super impressive, the data collection that you've done, just the sources of data.
And we'll be making this available to everyone. So give me 2 years and everyone can have it.
Yeah,
free.
Absolutely incredible. So I'm one of the things that I thought was extremely interesting was the variation across the types of roles that children can play within these organizations. And I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more of whether or not you observed variation in the types of roles across organizations. So let me explain that a little bit more. So for ISIS, it seems like children played a critical role in propaganda. But we can imagine that in a group, like an FSA brigade, children might be used in a very different role, right? Where they might be used for the battlefield effectiveness, where it gives them that split-second hesitation to send in the adult combatant. So I would be curious to see if you noticed any trends in how groups use children in the roles that they play in the groups, and then kind of a related question is, these benefits, as terrible as they are, as terrible as this whole thing is, I'm curious, because of these benefits, why do we observe terrorist organizations not using children? So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about negative cases.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Thank you so much. Let me start with the negative cases because that's an easy one. So I'm fortunate to have a few grad students helping me out, and so we went through the GTD terrorism list, and we did a random sampling, and then we did a systematic search. European terrorist groups on the right and the left required you to be 18. Now, the IRA, sometimes there were people who were under 18, because when I did my field research on the Falls Road in Northern Ireland, but they lied to the group and they lied to their parents. So for the most part, on the right and the left, so these are groups in Europe, required adult, and in fact, they recruited heavily from universities. And so there were groups, so that's where I said the ideology of the group becomes important, because if they absolutely refuse to have anyone under a certain age, maybe there's a few people that get past the post, but for the most part, that's it, there's no kids. So those were the negative cases. Or the cases where there would be a backlash in the community, such that the cost of having the child outweighed the benefit of, let's say, a surprise attack. Let me get to your first question about the trends in the battlefield. One of the things that, because we could get location on the data with the Free Syrian Army, I did a distance to crime. Now, again, distance to crime, if you're a criminologist, you know what I'm talking about, so I'll just, for the political scientists in the room, explain. Distance to crime is a theory in criminology that says, how far does someone venture to commit the crime? Do they commit the crime very far from home where no one's going to recognize them? Or do they do it close by because they know the terrain and they know the safe houses, they know where to go if they have to hide? And it's really well evidenced in Silence of the Lambs. So I'm assuming you guys have seen, everyone's seen Silence of the Lambs. At some point, Anthony Hopkins turns to Clarice and goes, "We covet what we seek." How did she find Buffalo Bill? She found Buffalo Bill by finding the very first person that he killed, and it was someone that he could watch all the time. So that this notion of distance to crime is that we're close to the location versus traveling distances so that you're going to perpetrate the crime, but you're less likely to accidentally kill someone you know, or less likely to be recognized by someone who knows you. With the Free Syrian Army, the vast majority of the children who were, now these were not kids who were killed in Ghouta by Assad's barrel bombs. These are kids who wore uniforms or makeshift uniforms and fought, died within 20 miles of where they were born. In other words, these were kids who joined the local militia brigades with their entire families and were motivated by what we would consider to be very patriotic incentives. This is different. If you look at the ISIS kids, they traveled huge distances, and there was a huge contingent of foreign fighters. And then there was also, one of the things that ISIS did was hugely manipulative. They took kids from Iraq in the orphanages, and they activated them in Syria. And they took kids from Syria, and they placed them in Iraq. And the reason they did that is because the kids would not know how to run away and go back to their families. So it was like the way the Korean comfort women were not guarded, because as the Japanese were taking Korean women to different islands in the South Pacific, they didn't speak the language, they didn't know the local terrain. Where were they going to go? So it was one of the things that ISIS did to manipulate the situation. And so the distance to, well, it's not crime, but the distance to crime method as applied to this variation, really interesting to indicate some sort of deliberate attempt to ensure that if the kids, because it's along the lines of Dara Cohen's work about coercion. Many of these kids that were in the orphanages and in the schools, they didn't voluntarily join ISIS. They were recruited forcibly. And so in being recruited forcibly, they were sent somewhere else where it would have been more difficult for them to defect. I think Lynn had a two-finger.
Lynn, was that a two-finger?
Oh, sorry.
I have you actually next on the list, unless you didn't have your finger up before.
So, okay, sorry. So let me finish then, because I thought you wanted to jump in as soon as I mentioned Dara. So basically, looking at where they were born and where they died, and then we did GIS mapping to get the distance of crime, was really interesting. So some of the Kurdish kids had traveled very, very far, but for the most part, they also stayed close to their villages. The FSA stayed close to their villages. The Hezbollah kids traveled very far. So you had the Lebanese kids going, or Iranian kids going to Shia areas in Iraq, because again, that was part of what they did to support their Shia brethren. And so that's where we got some really interesting variation in that location, in the location data.
Okay, Lynn, then Paul, then Jinru, then Maria.
I'm Lynn Nadine, emeritus here. This is a naive question. Is this using child soldiers? Is this extremely common? Were there children in the Crusades, in the 30 Years' War? Did I can't imagine in World War II, French resistance used children, although maybe they did. Did the Germans? And is there something different about what you're studying from any other cases that you might know of?
Absolutely. So you brought the book, so you'll see. Yeah, absolutely. So there's the Children's Crusade and the Crusades. There were, I think, in the American Revolution, we know from going through cemeteries, there were child soldiers as young as 12 and 13. So not just the ones that were the drummer boy, not just the ones that were holding, you know, some banner, but children who were actually fighting. So there were a handful, and of course, the Nazis used children, and that there were children's brigades. The Nazi youth were being trained. But for the most part, the difference is that in the intervening area, after 1996, there was a real shift in international politics about the normative element is whether or not countries and militias could continue to use kids in this way. Like there was this break. The international community came in, they made it very clear. And so if groups did use children and they continued to use children, they did so surreptitiously and they lied about it or they hid it. And all of a sudden ISIS comes onto the scene because we have, for example, Israeli allegations of Hamas and Islamic Jihad using children. For the last few years, there were a handful of cases. There was a handicapped child who was 15 years old who the Israelis caught, and there was a very famous video of him being publicly disrobed in order to get the bomb off of him, and the backlash that Hamas had used someone who was, you know, mentally handicapped, couldn't make the decision to be a bomber, but at the same time, Hamas and Islamic Jihad kept saying, we don't use kids, we don't use kids. There were certainly training camps for children, but in terms of the actual average age of most of these groups, ISIS is a huge pivot that not only did they use kids, but now we're seeing the kids getting younger and younger. And here's the best example prior to ISIS in 2007. In Afghanistan, there was this boy, 7 years old, named Juma Gul. Juma was, you know, illiterate from the village, and he goes up to Afghan national soldiers, ANA soldiers, and he goes, these men put something on me, and they told me to press this button. There's something, I don't believe it. They said, I'm going to get food. I don't believe it. And sure enough, he'd been tricked or duped into wearing a suicide vest. And the Afghan army very carefully took it off of him. And in fact, there was a huge party for him. They brought his brother, and Karzai, you know, celebrated him, took pictures with him, fed him, everything else. The Pashtun Valley of his village were so outraged that the Afghan Taliban had duped a 7-year-old into being a suicide bomber that they had previously never cooperated with the Americans, and all of a sudden they started cooperating. They were horrified and outraged at this manipulation. It's a completely different story when you look at ISIS. In ISIS, we have parents who are, you know, the boys that were in the car that I showed you. The parents are, you know, bye, have fun storming the castle. Like they give them this big hug and they send them off knowingly to their deaths. And so ISIS had managed to convey in this very short period from 2007 to 2014, they'd completely shifted the normative view of children's participation in conflict by, in many ways, grooming the parents the way Father O'Leary would have groomed the parents in Boston to have access to their kids. So that's why one of the implications is making it known to the sources of authority in the community that this is not a good outcome for the child. And in fact, all these other horrible additional things are going to happen. So that's where I think that there is a difference. But I did sort of do like a history of children's involvement in conflict, and never at this level and never at this percentage. This was a very high percentage in terms of the number of soldiers or young youth that they were training, but also this notion that it wasn't just about exploiting kids, because the ISIS cubs weren't every child. So ISIS took over the school in the areas that they controlled territorially. They took over the schools, the hospitals, the orphanages, and so on, and they took over the curriculum. And as I mentioned, I showed you the Huruf series for education. So initially, ISIS just used Saudi textbooks because the ideology was virtually indistinguishable until they started producing their own. But they didn't make training for cubs available to everyone. What they did was they made it something that was rare, over which the children had to compete, so that it became something that the children thought was wonderful because not everyone could get it. And so it's the scarcity model, this notion of, oh, well, you have to aspire to be a cub and you'll be selected to then die for the cause. So it is a very strange way of, like, if it's a good and if it's a source of manpower, then why not use all of them? Like Iris was saying, why not all terrorist groups using them? Like, why only this particular group? And yet, what we have is we have this notion of creating a structure within the society, because they couldn't let all the kids die. They needed the kids to survive a little bit. And so what they created was a competition amongst the kids, almost to make participation in the Cubs this rarefied and wonderful outcome. And so, for example, the kids that got into the Cubs would be marched through the streets with their new outfits, their new camo, and all the kids would be looking upon it and, you know, jockeying to get the best position to watch the parade. And all the kids are envious, like, okay, I didn't get in this time. I'm going to try harder. And so one of the benefits has been a lot of, as you guys know, since the end of the territorial element of the conflict, a lot of reporters have gone in and they've talked to the kids. And so we're getting even more of the backstory of how they all competed. But here's the perverse part as well, aside from conveying to children that the best thing you can do with your life is to die. The kids were empowered in ways that was counter to their culture. So in their culture, children, I mean, it's different from here. In their culture, the children eat last, whatever's left over. They're, you know, it's a very different approach. All of a sudden now the kid is responsible for whether or not his parents have a roof over their heads and have food and have money. And they found this to be very empowering. They actually liked the feeling of power that they were given by ISIS, that when you now have to reintegrate these children and in many ways treat them like kids again, disempower them, they actually find that very upsetting. And so what was so strange, and I saw this in Pakistan as well, is that the kids at least reported having had very positive experiences in the terrorist group. Like they were able to hang out with their friends. So they had this feeling of band of brothers. They enjoyed themselves. They liked the power of holding a gun and shooting a gun, and that people respected them, whereas before they were just kids. And so it is really one of the other challenges for DDR and reintegration of these kids is finding a mechanism where they still feel empowered as youth and children, but not because they're carrying guns and killing people. So it was very complicated, and it's one of the reasons why I work closely with Boston Children's Hospital, the Refugee Trauma Center, and Heidi Ellis is a psychologist. And so, you know, we've been, the last part of this Minerva grant is we're putting together a manual, because in many of the instances, there are countries in Nigeria, there are 12 psychologists for the entire country. For the 74 kids in Kosovo, they only have 20 therapists for 74 kids. So there are countries in which there isn't a very strong background and tradition of psychotherapy. We're trying to put something together, sort of like move it from 6.1 basic research to 6.2 applied, so that they can have at least the beginnings of what do you do with the kids, and how do you empower a child who previously only felt power by walking around with a gun and a uniform and killing people, but now you want to turn them sort of in the right direction. Because the concern that I have, and I'm going back to Asfandyar's question just for a second, it's not that I'm worried that these kids are Manchurian candidates that are going to be reactivated in a few years. The concern is that the same skill set that they have been taught as cubs are very useful for criminal networks and gangs and other very negative psychological sequelae that has nothing to do with terrorism. And so it's very important that we intervene, not just because we're worried about terrorism, but it's very important we intervene so we don't have a lost generation. I still have two more, Paul and Jinru.
There's a couple more after that now. So Paul?
How am I doing on time? Okay.
Okay.
First, to apologize, I'm going to need to leave after I listen
No,
to you.
no, thank you so much for coming.
But, and part of what you just said answered part of my question, but I want to first say, I can't believe you can do this, and I would like to hear a little bit about how you survive, you know, looking at images.
I drink a lot. You guys follow me on Twitter. There's a lot of bourbon in my life.
Right, okay. But the other question is about, you know, you've said a couple of times that 1996, there was a report, and then the incidence of child soldiers dropped off dramatically all over the place. And I just have a hard time imagining how that could be so effective in so many places with terrorist groups that are inherently kind of you know, outside the mainstream of their societies.
Well, so it's not that they necessarily dropped off, but it's that they stopped bragging about it. They stopped putting it front and center. You know, Scott Gates has this fantastic edited volume on child soldiers. And one of the things that I also challenge is, you hear 300,000 child soldiers. And that number is bandied about all the time. And no one's ever taken it apart to say, well, where are you getting the, well, you know, it's a guesstimate. I remember the Quilliam Foundation during the ISIS conflict put out a report, and they said 31,000 women were pregnant in ISIS. And my incredibly sarcastic Twitter comment was, how nice of the women to get pregnant in such round numbers. And so that's why I was really very circumspect about the generalizations or proxy variables or taking a percentage and then doing a calculation. I was actually counting the numbers. But what we were able to do is, over the course of just between the field research and the interviews, and then talking to people who had been involved in terrorist groups as children and what their experience was like. In Northern Ireland, hearing that people had to lie about their age, in the same way that, you know, you see that during the Second World War, people really wanted to serve, and so that they would fudge their age in order to be able to, or get their parents' signature, that they would, you know, maybe forge the parents' permission. This is a new shift, that not only are the groups not embarrassed about it, putting it front and center, but that the communities that previously rejected exploitation of children are either okay with it, or they're not opposing it in the same way. Even in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, it was really interesting seeing this change. Now in Pakistan now, we do see ISIS is having a challenge recruiting in places where either existing Al-Qaeda groups are well ensconced, or other militant jihadi groups. And in fact, the Al-Qaeda groups were one of the groups that said, you know, well, we're not going to use the kids in this way. So Jabhat al-Nusra in that graph had a very low base rate of exploiting children. So you've got two groups that in some ways ideologically are not that different. Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS, and yet one using lots of kids and one not at all. Oh, and I forgot to answer one of the questions about why were they a late adopter. And I think half of that had to do with the fact that ISIS only comes onto the scene officially in 2013. In the early period, there was this amorphousness between what was Jabhat al-Nusra, what was ISIS, and then finally the official announcement in 2014, and the break between ISIS and al-Qaeda. Because if ISIS starts as sort of vestigial al-Qaeda in Iraq, there was this al-Qaeda link. And if they had to break from al-Qaeda, they had to break from this ideology that at least was circumspect about using kids. Oh, and as far as me, I mean, I joked about the drinking. I mean, ISIS already thinks I'm an alcoholic. You know, when I did my dissertation on comparative genocide, and I remember having nightmares about the Hutus coming after me with machetes, and I remember being chased by Hutus in my dreams. I think that, and this is again, I remember Jack Snyder saying, you know, he'd studied nuclear proliferation, and my dissertation was perhaps one of the most depressing he read. I think it's important. It's important that we do this work because it's important that we make known the horrors of the world. But also, one of the things that I've noticed, and this is going to be counterintuitive, women are able to do it better than men. Women get access in ways that the men don't. I can't tell you how many times when I was in Sri Lanka with the LTTE, with the leadership, and they'd be like, it's just a woman. We can speak freely. You know, and so being underestimated, as well as the fact that, I don't know, women, maybe I'm generalizing, but that we can multitask, we can compartmentalize, we can handle it. But I do, having said that, we have on staff in Georgia State for my grad students, we have a therapist that comes in, and we have a certain template. I say, you know, no looking at this stuff before bed, and take lots of breaks. And I take my grad students and we go to yoga. Like, I insist that there's a way of doing this kind of research that you don't want to traumatize yourself and have, because I don't want them having nightmares about Hutus chasing them with sticks.
Thanks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paul.
So we'll take one more, and I think Deepak and Maria are both going to dinner, so that can ask our question then. So Jinri, you get the last question.
So actually, kind of answer my question. I have two questions. The first one is how do I'm sharing a myself here. The first question, which you answered, is just how do you actually keep sanity while doing and watching all these kind of disturbing videos? And the second one is regarding the prescription that you might have in mind, because it's always hard to be the good guy, especially when your opponent does not have a moral bottom line. So I see like what we can do. I can imagine, I'm not an expert on this, but like, what I can imagine is other US or other government can do, the thing they can do is more like reactive. They do counter propaganda, they do the sort of rehabilitation kind of thing. I was wondering, is there any like proactive things we can do to like mitigate this kind of usage of children? And what would be the biggest challenge you have heard so far when talking to the policy world regarding this kind of, you know, like the usage of child, the countering the usage of the child soldiers?
So one of the things in terms of the maintaining sanity, this is going to sound really strange, but it actually is based on studies. Windows. Don't work in a windowless room. I mean, we used to in Columbia have these carols in the bowels of the library, and some of us didn't see the light of day for long, other than going home. But so taking lots of breaks, having hobbies, all of our meetings, we meet every 2 weeks. I make baked goods, so I bake for them. I have in my office, I have a cappuccino maker and a drawer full of snacks, so that they feel very well taken care of. And I also make sure that, and again, this is just me, but they get a lot of credit. So I co-author with them, and I mentor them, and I take them with me to conferences, and I make sure that they know that this work, that they're not being exploited. So I don't know, maybe that helps, but that's one of the maintaining of sanity. So that, you know, my grad students are paid better. They each have $2,000 to $3,000 of travel money. They're taken care of in every way. And I do that by writing grants. And I write a lot of grants so that they can have the benefits. Because the other grad students that don't work with me will complain and say, well, she works you too hard. Why is she making you do all this stuff? You work 40, 50, 60 hours a week. We don't work hardly. And so that's the maintaining sanity. So we try to, I hate to make it sound so instrumental, but I try to take care of them that way. The counter messaging is a really good point. It's obviously the terrorist groups are not going to listen to the West, like Paul was saying, not to use kids. But we can address the message to the families and the communities and that Brofenbrenners, all of those circles, to make the parents say no. When I was in Sri Lanka during the conflict, so 2002, 2003, at some point, the mothers didn't want the kids being recruited at school, and they started homeschooling the kids. And that sent a very powerful message to the LTTE that they had lost the moms. So I think the moms are a major focus for counter messaging. And it's not women in general, it's the moms. Because the women can be just as radicalized, if not more so, than the men. But the mothers, it's the reason why with the terrorist organizations, if someone's going to be a suicide bomber, they don't let them talk to their mother. They keep them away from the mother, lest talking to the mother makes you change your mind. In my case, it might have actually made me go faster because my mother was crazy. But no, they actually keep you away from your mom. Now, I'm mostly kidding. What's the biggest challenge? The biggest challenge has been, you know, the sort of, maybe because of clicks, maybe because of, you know, getting readers, baby bombers, kitty terrorists, kitty killers. Like this idea that the kids are innately evil, even though they're just kids. So that's been in the policy world the biggest challenge, is trying to convey that the kids are salvageable, that we can fix them, that they can have a happy and normal life. And so some of the anecdotes that I can bring back from Pakistan, there was one boy, Muhammad, who he voluntarily joined the Pakistani Taliban, and he was being groomed by the commander of the particular unit in a leadership capacity. And once he got out and he was having adjustment problems, one of the things he realized was actually he was super smart. And so the Sabaun group got him back up to his educational level immediately. And he had psychosocial treatment by a therapist and a social worker. He had vocational training because he was very, very smart. And then retraining in Islam. He then got into medical school. And Sabaun paid for his medical school. So he went back to his village now. Now he's going to be a doctor. So he's going to help his community, not by being part of the Taliban, but being a doctor and helping his community that way. And so having alternate paths is the most important thing, because wanting to help, wanting to do something for your community is a natural instinct. A lot of the things that ISIS did was they just showed stuff that you would see on the BBC or CNN. It was outrageous what Assad was doing. At the end of the day, Assad killed far more people than ISIS did. And yet he's still in power, and that problem persists. But we have to be able to show how do you pivot to do pro-social rather than just angry reactions to these things. You need me to shut up.
No, please join me in thanking Professor Mia Bloom for excellent talk.